Okay, good morning. Thanks, Benny, for inviting me. I didn't make it last year, unfortunately. I'm glad that I'm back. And I'm really happy to have been given this paper because it led me to think more about some of the issues that are important for society. Specifically, they are dealing with a very big research question. Public pension funds are big. And there are two big characteristics that I want to bring to your attention why this is an interesting research question. One is the size. Obviously, that makes it important for us to understand from an asset management point of view what these managers are doing and whether they are destroying or creating value. The second one is the underfundedness of these funds. So we know that public pension funds have this big problem going forward, and therefore if we identify reasons why they may be underperforming and therefore reducing the potential effect of this underfundedness, that will be important. So these are two worrying trends for us to consider: generous pension benefits and also accumulating pension funding shortfalls. And therefore this paper speaks to that, and speaks to that in a very innovative way. Therefore there are big implications for society. This paper takes a very different view of these agency conflicts. We know very little to start with about agency conflicts in asset management. We know even little, much less in pension funds, and especially in public pension funds. And the idea here is that the way that politicized pension boards are behaving in one dimension, in letting outrage from society seeping through in the compensation scheme for managers, may be impacting both portfolio allocation and also ultimately performance. And that is very, very important. Okay, what are the main results? First, I have to say that I'm quite impressed with the level of data that the authors have. I have always been interested in pension funds, but apparently it's very hard to get data. This is one of the few papers that I know about that have this global sample of a sizable number of public pension schemes, and it's throughout different countries from 1995 to 2004. And there are two main results. There are many, many results, but I want to summarize them in two broad results. First of all, I am the type of person who I really like papers that have a theoretical model or a theoretical framework, and perhaps this paper does not have a theoretical model, but it has definitely a theoretical framework that really helps focus minds, because it's not easy to model all these moving parts. And the theoretical framework, the conclusion that these trustees of public pension funds internalize this outrage that's coming from society. They end up employing lower skilled managers because they can't give them higher compensation. So this outrage pushes you to lower the compensation given to your managers, and at that point you are going to have lower, less skilled managers. Now that is going to affect then the ability of these lower skill managers to go with the right portfolio allocation and choose the right type of stocks or the right type of assets. Then they go in the empirical part, and that is what they show essentially, that this outrage pay constraints on compensation impacts fund performance. And a back of the envelope calculation that Alex did is that if you were to increase compensation to these managers by $82,000, you are going to have sizable benefits. So where are my comments? My comments are going to be, I think, on 4 dimensions, I guess. Given that Benny is very strict with time, I'm going to have 3 comments. First is the paper's contribution, or perhaps 2 if I hope to. Second comment is limits. I want to push the authors more about these limits of the compensation performance nexus. The third comment is going to be the mechanism driving the results within the asset allocation and performance, not so much across funds, but within asset, I would like to understand a little bit better the mechanisms. And then the last one is the delegation decision. Alex moved very quickly there, but I would like to speak a little bit about this. And the major running theme is going to be partly the interpretation of these results. And I think the interpretation should be made cleaner, I think crispier, not through more worries about the identification strategy. I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt on the identification strategy frontier, because this is a very interesting question. I'm sure that if the authors had better data, they would have done a slightly better job on the identification, but we don't have the data, but the question remains still very important. Okay, so what do I like a lot about this? And I'm going to move fast on the paper's contribution. So besides the fact that this is a very broad and important research question, I keep on saying that, the one thing that I like is that most of the existing literature, when papers came to understand these agency conflicts within pension funds, they always look at politicians sitting on the board, political connectedness, so on and so forth, if you want to increase really the whole story. Here, the authors for the first time are looking at a very interesting dimension, which is there is outrage in society. These public pension funds are owned to a certain extent by society. The beneficiaries are outraged about compensation, and who is acting on their behalf? The trustees are choosing people who are less skilled because they can't give them better compensation. That, I think, is a very innovative approach. And that is the second reason why I would be more than happy to give the authors the benefit of the doubt about having an exact identification strategy. So I think it's an appropriate and careful empirical analysis. The counterfactual problem, the what-if problem, is big here, and I think the way they have done it, first having a theoretical framework and then having the right data to those two equations to test it, I find it appropriate. Now, where I have some questions starts here. First of all, I would like to make the point about the limits of compensation performance, this link. I have here the descriptive statistics of what manager compensation is in these funds. So the mean is about 800,000, and the median is about $540,000. Now, questions like this, statistics like this, start generating questions like, for example, what is the correct benchmark for the skill and composition levels that we want to talk about? Secondly, is it the case, even in asset management point of view, that higher compensation translates necessarily into higher performance in the asset management space? And I'm going to push a little bit on this one. And then, is it simply or only the compensation that is important, or is there something else, like, for example, the discussion over risk taking? Now, I am pushing this a little bit, but I'm aware that going into this discussion over risk taking, that is, there may, inside the pension funds, there may be constraints about what these managers can do, irrespective of their compensation. That may be hard to test, okay? So let me deal a little bit with this part. And I want to ask a number of questions related to these numbers, okay? Doing that, I have to, and I apologize for that, bring up a little bit of my own work, which I know is the only one that looked at compensation in this space. And I'm going to compare these compensation numbers to a recent paper that I have with Marco Pagano and Annalisa Scognamiglio in a completely different space, which is hedge funds. Now, I want you to understand the 800,000, right, in the pension funds. With what we find, this is not individual specific compensation, this is imputed compensation. And in the hedge fund that we have, we find that the CEOs are earning about 3.7 million, and the top executives, like for example CFO, CIO, are earning about 1.6 million. So, to a large extent, what these individuals in the pension funds are getting, this 800,000, is somewhere here. Okay? Somewhere here. Now, there are two important things that I want to highlight. First, if it is true that we want to make the claim that higher compensation is going to lead to higher performance in any case, then we would expect that the hedge fund industry, attracting higher skilled people, is going to generate a lot of performance. We don't have that. First of all, we have a lot of liquidations, and these are liquidations for bad performance. This also comes from the paper. You can see a good number of liquidations even before the financial crisis. And the literature also identified that there's hardly any alpha here. Now, I am completely sold on the argument that Alex and his co-authors are doing, that obviously, most probably, the level of skill in these pension funds is very slow. That is true, because we are giving them less. But I would like to have a more nuanced interpretation of these results, saying it's not necessarily true that higher compensation is going to lead to higher performance. And therefore, what I would like to understand, for example, is when you get this number, the 800,000, which I assume is total compensation, it's not fixed compensation, because that's a question that I had, like a clarification question, that is likely to be the total compensation. To what, to which type of pension funds are we going to compare in order to get higher, more skilled individuals? What is the benchmark that we have in mind in order to make the argument, look, if we pay them 100,000 more, we are going to get a better performance, okay? So first of all, it is not necessarily true that higher compensation leads to this higher performance in the first place. And secondly, it would be interesting, first of all, to give some preliminary analysis about these numbers, to what we should be comparing them, and then what the other suggestion that I would make is, before you go into the analysis, it would be interesting to understand what is the cross-sectional heterogeneity of this number across different pension funds with different political power. Okay? Because it would be interesting whether the more politicized pension funds are having this problem more than others. That is as far as the first comment goes. The second comment that I would like to understand a little bit more is the following. It's about the mechanisms that you have in mind. So here is an interesting table that I found extremely useful. This is the impact of the outrage on performance, and forget, as Alex did, on portfolio. Focus on alternatives, public equities, and fixed income. Now, what you find is that the impact seems to be larger in the case of alternatives. This is quite important. Why is it quite important? Although it's only about 20%, as Alex said, over the last 10 years, there's a Nifashina and paper recently over the last 10 years, that is where in pension funds, this is the asset class that is exploding the most, across private and public. So you see a big impact here on alternatives, on public equities, nothing on fixed income. And I would like to understand better what is the mechanism here behind it. That is it skill, or is it something else? Like, for example, your ability to make decisions on portfolio allocation is being constrained in some way. For example, let us say that you will look at the equity space. And this is about 50% of the portfolio. In equity space, we already know from the literature, right, that one way that you don't sort of underperform is to choose something as simple as passive investment strategies. So why is it that these funds do not adopt a passive investment fund? Because most probably this is because they are going into active when I know that you should not be doing it, because by your own argument they are not skillful. So why not choose something which is passive? Where the skill dimension really comes out is on the alternatives, right? That is essentially where you need a lot of skill. But then, as Alex has been saying, it is possible that what is coming in this space is being occupied by the private equity in your area, for example. So what it would be interesting to look at is, do you have the actual investments in each of these asset classes, and see whether they are investing in local private equity funds or not. One way that you can make the identification strategy stronger is to give the statistic, because obviously if they are investing in private equity which is not in that area, that will make your identification strategy stronger. Right? And therefore, there is a lot of preliminary evidence that you can provide that will lead us to think, okay, is this just skill here, or is it something else? I think that the fact that you are seeing this effect on public equities, when a simple solution exists, that you go into passive, it is telling me that there's something else. It is possible that there is some kind of binding constraint that even a skilled manager, even a skilled and therefore more expensive manager may not be doing, because his or her hands are going to be tied by these constraints about which investment strategies. So it would be interesting to really shed light on this. I know that perhaps it's impossible for you to get this information, but something like this goes on. Might be interesting. The last thing that I want to mention is this delegation of investment decision. So Alex is saying, rightly so, that perhaps if I'm not skillful enough, I'm going to delegate. Right? And that is what they find. I would also go back to asking the question, you really have to pay attention to which benchmark we have to look at for this decision. There is a paper that may be of interest for you, the Goyal and Wahal 2008. It's about private plan sponsors, and they find that effectively these guys hire investment managers after superior performance, they delegate them, but on average, post-hiring excess returns are zero. Right? And therefore, one has to really understand what is this. How is this delegation of investment decision feeding into the whole entire equation? So in terms of conclusions, I find this paper very innovative, very interesting. It looks at a completely new angle. I find it extremely refreshing. It's well executed, not easy given the counterfactual problem that I mentioned before. The suggestions are about the interpretation of results, which is still problematic, one can find ways to make them clearer, and also the mechanisms behind the within asset class performance.
You owe me 5 minutes for next year, okay. Questions?
Question: Can we alleviate the outrage constraint through outsourcing? You know, by hiring managers, or do they pick up on that too? Like remember Steve Ross and Dick Roll used to manage several hundreds of millions of dollars with CalPERS, and I don't know that the board ever knew how much they were paying them.
What if I get a couple questions, then I'll try to handle them. How much time do we have in total, Benny? Okay. Marco?
Yeah, I also thought the outsourcing question is the obvious one, because outsourcing is endogenous. I mean, if you're a civil servant, you're quite trained at outsourcing because that's what you do. You might have public procurement contracts, you might be quite good at that. You might be very poor at running a portfolio yourself, but you might actually be very good to hire outside managers. And that, of course, also depends on the asset class, in addition to what Andrew said about indexing with problems. So I thought also that the outsourcing decision, that in addition to the stealth, Kevin mentioned, that was an important aspect.
Bernie?
So this is related to Andrew's question about, is there extra return if you pay your investment manager more? I have become a skeptic on any T statistic less than 3. There are just too many degrees of freedom. And you don't have them. You've got relatively weak T statistics. They're not hidden. But the question is the effect really there or not? And I think I would look at your results and say I'm not persuaded that it's that there really would be extra payoff for paying your investment managers more than they're now getting paid.
Well, I'll try to answer this round, and then I'll do another round. Okay, so yeah.
Can you check whether your outrage variable have anything to do with the asset allocation at the fund level? Because a teacher in the board may have heard horror stories about the derivatives, so strong objection to invest in the alternative assets. So, it's related to Andrew's point. So it's not just the compensation; their hands are tied.
Okay, let me just take this round. So the last question is really kind of a question of our identification, which is outrage might have a direct effect on asset allocation choices in addition to an indirect effect through the compensation channel. And can I completely rule that out as an alternative? And I think the main effect is true, but this is kind of a statement as opposed to we control for politics by having variables that also have a direct and an indirect effect. So if there's a chair of the board that's a politician, we capture that, but I don't capture these trustee effects. So I can't totally rule it. To Bernie's question, is the effect really there? This is one of those stories, I think, where it's super important. There's a small number of data points, and the kind of question is, do we wait for data that's never going to be there before we exploring the question? And I'm on the side of, no, let's use the best data that we have to do this, and I'm perfectly happy if people are not convinced entirely by the results, because the statistical significance is what it is. I personally, having been on the board for the Center for Pension Management and seeing what my own, this is an understatement of what I think the real effects are. So for example, in terms of managing alternative assets, the ability to get snowed by a not sophisticated, if someone's managing the Washington State Investment Board, $25 billion in assets, the guy makes zero pay for performance, gets $200,000 a year. Do I think he's being snowed by the parade of private equity guys coming in selling? Yes. Do I think if you have someone who's making $6 billion who used to work in one of those funds and is on the Canadian pension plan when these guys are trying to sell them some malarkey, I think that they do better. So if you're asking the mechanism, kind of getting to the same mechanism question, I think part of it is that you're better able to bridge the information asymmetries in these risky asset classes, which I think is important to both select the right managers if you're using external management, and if you're going to do internal management, to know when you're going to do like co-invest with an outside manager or not. And I think actually having people who are skilled enough to know, and it's also building a team, like part of having high wages is you actually have a team of people, which seems to be successful in this. So, Bernie, fair enough, you can be skeptical. But and this kind of speaks a bit to the mechanism, and that's why I like at least we have the story about insourcing versus outsourcing. I think a certain amount of insourcing helps you to generate better returns, both in your external asset managers, because you're good enough to be able to, however smart these executives are, I don't think they do a good job in getting either real estate or private equity or hedge funds if they don't know at all what they're talking about. I think there's a certain minimum level of skill to be able to do that. It's like, David Swenson, they still do outsourcing, but they've got smart enough people within there. And so that brings to the final point, which is what's a natural reference point? Your data, I'm happy to cite your paper next time because it gives a reference point. We sort of think maybe private endowments might be a natural reference point to think what their wages are. And again, they're 5x is kind of what I think is a reference point. I would say these guys aren't being paid market level wages, even though we didn't document that as much as we could. Do I have time for another round of questions or not?
I think we'll take a break.
Okay.
We have 10 minutes break. You can.
10 minutes. Okay, let's go eat. I'm starving. I didn't eat anything in the morning because I don't like to eat. I'll be right back.